Spotlight, lectures and performances on and around Albany State University.
Good morning, everyone. Dr. Dianne Marie Stewart Diakite was born in Kingston, Jamaica, and grew up in Hartford, Connecticut. She has a Bachelor's of Arts degree from Colgate University in English and African American Studies, a Master of Divinity degree from Harvard Divinity School, and a PhD degree in Systematic Theology from Union Theological Seminary in New York City, where she studied with well-known scholars such as Dolores Williams, the late James Washington, and her advisor James Cone. Dr. Diakite is an associate professor of religion and African American studies at Emory University, where she teaches courses in the graduate and undergraduate curricula. Prior to Emory, she taught at the College of the Holy Cross in Massachusetts and the Macalester College in Minnesota. Dr. Diakite's research and teaching interests include theologies and religious practices of the African diaspora, with particular emphasis upon African-derived religion in the Americas and the Caribbean, Black, womanist, and Caribbean liberation theologies, theory and method in Black religious studies, and the interreligious dialogue amongst communities in the African diaspora. Dr. Diakite is the author of 3 Eyes for the Journey, African Dimensions of the Jamaican Religious Experience. She has also written a number of articles and essays, including a co-author essay with Dr. Tracy Hucks, African American Religions, History of Study, which was published in the latest edition of the Encyclopedia of Religion in 2005. Other articles include Christian Doctrines of Humanity and the African Experience of Evil and Suffering towards a Black Theological Anthropology. Beyond her work in Trinidad and Jamaica, Dr. Diakite has studied and lectured in a number of African, Latin American, and Caribbean countries, including Nigeria, South Africa, Mexico, Guatemala, Cuba, and Bermuda. She spent a year and a half conducting research as a Fulbright Scholar in 2006 and 2007 in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where she studied the history of religions in Central Africa during the slave period and prophetic religious movements in Congo today. She aims to translate her rich research experience in the DRC through several articles in a published book on local and transnational legacies of African Christianity in West Central Africa and the Black Atlantic world. Dr. Diakite has committed herself to the vocation of teaching and research with the intention of inspiring students and other audiences, whether it be in the classroom, church, temple, mosque, prison, or community center, to commit to a life of crucial, helpful, and progressive thinking about religion, politics, and social, communal, and personal information. Ladies and gentlemen, help me by welcoming Dr. Dianne Marie Stewart Diakite.
Thank you so much for the introduction to the English majors who will soon be graduating. Congratulations. This is my second lecture in the lecture series, and I had a wonderful time last night meeting students and dining with students and faculty. And last night I spoke about Central African religious traditions in Jamaica. And today I want to turn to another Anglophone Caribbean context, Trinidad, and focus on 2 particular women. I realized that I spoke a little long last night, so I have my cell phone this time, and I'm going to be checking the time. And I reduced my lecture a bit to focus in on just 2 women, 2 priests who represent different, diverse theological lineages or theological traditions in the Nigerian Arisha-based religion of Trinidad. I probably shouldn't just say Nigerian, because once these traditions made their way to the Caribbean and the Americas, they really incorporate Pan-African elements, even if some cultures, some religious heritages and civilizations of Africa seem to be most pronounced, and Nigeria would be the most pronounced. in the Arisha religion in Trinidad. So I've titled this presentation, Women in the Arisha Religion of Trinidad, Prestige, Power, and Performance in the Public Domain. If we have time during questions and answers, there are 3 or 4 other women that I would love to just tell you about in terms of what they're doing in the public domain in Trinidad to change the image of Arisha in the general public's imagination. And they're just quite remarkable women. Certainly there are men too. It's not that there aren't, but I just found the collective work of these women to be so significant that I felt that they deserved some attention in an ongoing manuscript that I'm working on. Trinidad is the larger of 2 inhabited islands of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. Slightly smaller than the state of Delaware, the island is located in the southernmost region of the Caribbean. Among its multi-ethnic and multi-religious population of about 1.2 million are descendants of enslaved Africans who comprised one of the 2 largest ethnic groups in the island. So East Indians comprise about 40%, and descendants of enslaved and indentured Africans comprise about 37.5%. Given its conspicuous history of African religious traditions, Trinidad lends much to the discussion of African heritage religions in the Western Hemisphere. The 2 major African-based religious traditions in Trinidad are known as Arisha and Spiritual Baptists, or Spiritual and Shouter Baptists. Those are 2 distinct traditions, but people often connect them because they're related. Orisha is traditionally referred to as Shango. So many of the older residents would call the Orisha tradition Shango by one of the names of its prominent deities. These traditions, Arisha in particular, is a derivation of the Yoruba religion of Nigeria, while the Spiritual Baptists are self-identified African Christians. And I talked last night about the revival tradition, which emerged out of the Native Baptist Mayo heritage in Jamaica. The Spiritual Baptists and Shouter Baptists are very, very similar. They even hold conferences across the Caribbean and meet with revivalists. So they're almost like twin religious traditions. Scholars are not conclusive on the exact dates of origin and geographical location of the first Yoruba community in Trinidad. Nevertheless, they have been able to document that an influx of Yoruba laborers arrived in Trinidad between the 1830s and the 1850s as liberated Africans and settled as a free community in the northeastern section of Trinidad. How many people were here last night? So most of you. I'll just briefly say this is a really important detail because the communal narrative in Trinidad, as in many Caribbean countries, is that, well, these traditions were here since slavery. You know, these traditions carried on since slavery. They endured slavery, and certainly some did. But with the Yoruba religion of Trinidad, we really don't have any evidence that the traditions were active before this period of indentured laborers came into Trinidad. And so this is between the 1830s, late 1830s, 38 to 1850s, that we believe Yoruba tradition, many scholars who are studying this believe Yoruba tradition would have been established. So it does contradict that notion that our ancestors have been practicing this religion since slavery. Slavery ended in Trinidad in 1834, and the period of indentured labor for former slaves ended in 1838. That's when the British government began to transport liberated Africans into Trinidad, those that they rescued from slave ships en route to other regions of the Atlantic world that still practiced slavery. So it's in this period that the Yoruba tradition is getting established in Trinidad. Though, as I said, if you go on the ground in Trinidad and say that, most people are going to say, no, this tradition has been here since slavery. And Trinidad is interesting because it's very much unlike other Caribbean colonies. The Spanish that settled the island, Columbus landed there in 1498, used indigenous labor into the late 17th century. The first Africans came in the early 1600s, but only about 500. And it's not until 1783 that we begin to get thousands of Africans coming in. By the end of of emancipation, if we call that 1838, there are 24,000 liberated Africans. Let me not say liberated, emancipated Africans in Trinidad who were former slaves, compared to 4 million in the United States or 500,000 in Jamaica. A very, very low number. Given its conspicuous history, I talked about that already, sorry. The Arisha tradition emphasizes service to the Orishas, or deities. I shouldn't say Orishas, I should say Arisha. We like to pluralize these Yoruba terms by putting an S, but that's not correct. Ancestral veneration and appeasing of the spirits or deities with food offerings and animal sacrifice, divination readings and communal rituals involving prayers, singing, drumming, dancing, chanting, and the embodiment of the Arisha through spirit manifestation and mediumship. Central to Arisha ceremonial life is a 6-day observance of an annual ebo, or feast. And they're called feasts in part because the tradition imbibed or embraced some of the Catholic rituals. So the feast days that were dedicated to the Catholic saints also became Arisha ebo days. Within the Arisha tradition, feasts serve multiple purposes. First and foremost, they mark a time when the bond between the Arisha and adherents is reinforced through devotional activities. Feasts serve as healing rites where supplications are made concerning health and other personal issues. And finally, they are ritual arenas where the Arisha manifest in human bodily form, bringing advice as well as admonishment to the community of devotees. In Trinidad, Arisha feasts or ebo ceremonies are carried out in structured ritual environments. Worship life for devotees is centered around a palais or public ritual space with an earthen floor, a chapel or small altar room where ritual paraphernalia and sacred items for the Arisha are kept, and consecrated concrete mounds or stools where individual Arisha are enshrined. The Arisha community in Trinidad also has a rich and complex ritual relationship with another African-oriented tradition, the spiritual Baptist. For example, the central Arisha initiation rite incorporates major aspects of the spiritual Baptist morning ritual, something you don't see in other Arisha-based diaspora communities. I was shocked when I saw that the Arisha initiates actually go on the ground and mourn like the revivalists or the spiritual Baptists. And what we learned, a colleague and I have been doing this work together, in interviewing and talking with and visiting shrines and shrine leaders, is that the spiritual Baptist tradition really kept the Arisha religion going when it was heavily persecuted. I mean, both were persecuted throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, but the spiritual Baptists could camouflage it a little bit more, and so some of those rituals became very central in Arisha traditions there. Indeed, the two groups share multiple ritual practices, and members are often dually aligned with both traditions in official and de facto arrangements and capacities. Spiritual Baptists and Arisha both adhere to salient African-derived practices such as drumming and chanting, the ring shout, or a form of it, I would argue, spirit possession, ancestral veneration, a communal theistic conception of the divine, and divination and herbalism. Dreams are very, very important to the spiritual Baptist and Arisha tradition as a source of divine revelation. And the mothers, the spiritual mothers, the women are so powerful in dream interpretation. The mothers in the spiritual Baptist and the Arisha tradition sometimes have ultimate authority because of their ability to tap into divine revelation through dreams. Dreams are a very important source of herbal knowledge and healing for many of these Arisha priests and spiritual Baptist mothers, as they're called. In addition, the spiritual Baptist ritual space includes a center pole symbolizing contact with the invisible world domain, with food offerings and sacred paraphernalia, constituting an altar at its base, and esoteric veve-like drawings also demarcate sacred space at the entranceway. So when we talk about veve, we're talking about the cornmeal-based or chalk-based drawings that we'll see in Haitian voodoo. And each drawing is a symbol of a particular deity. It is a language system, so to speak. And this tradition recalls in some ways the Mpemba, the sacred white chalk, which is also a form of medicine too in Central Africa among Congo adherents. You'll find it in parts of South Africa as well. And Mpemba in Congo cosmology represents the mountain of the dead, the world of the dead. It is, the world of the dead is a world of white. That's why you see so much white in ritual ceremonies, or even when babies are born. Not just in Congo, but in many African contexts, people put white chalk on their face because it shows that they're coming from that invisible world domain. They're coming from the world of the ancestors, the world of white. So these white chalk drawings are similar to what we see in voodoo. In addition to Christian carryovers from the spiritual Baptist tradition, the historical interplay of Catholicism and Yoruba practices is often evident in the use of Catholic iconography and Catholic prayers in Arisha shrines and ceremonies. As with many African-derived traditions in the New World, Catholic images and symbols were incorporated into African religious systems, primarily during slavery within contexts where African religious practices were heavily censored, though that is not the full story. We talked yesterday about the fact that some of these captives of Central African heritage would have been exposed to Catholicism. Some were even professed Catholics and would have brought some of these Catholic elements with them. And there's more research going on about those kinds of translational dialogues that were already happening in Africa before captives came to the United States. But certainly a lot of camouflage was going on in response to censorship. As a result, associations of Catholic saints were made with African deities with respect to public representation. The Arisha community has struggled to overcome condemnation and persecution in the colonial and post-colonial Caribbean experience. In 1868, Trinidad instituted a series of laws against the practice of obeah, making it a criminal offense with severe legal consequences. And so we have to think, 1868, remember, Trinidad does not have a large African population until about the 1800s relative. And so in 1868, what's happening? This is after almost 30 years of those importation of Central Africans and Yorubas especially. Those were the high numbers that were coming in as liberated Africans from those slave ships en route to Brazil and Cuba. So it's interesting that we begin to see this legislation now. And they would have been bringing their religious practices with them. And these practices get lumped under the designation obeah, and I can talk about obeah more. I've written extensively on obeah. I can do that if anyone has questions. Legal repression in Trinidad lasted well into the 20th century, when a preponderance of laws were integrated into the Summary Offenses Act of 1921, prohibiting public dance processions, singing and dancing in public or private yards, and the beating of drums. So this is affecting Arisha and spiritual Baptist communities, these general prohibitions against dancing, drumming, etc. With the 1951 repeal of some of the oppressive legislation against African-based religions, the Arisha community gained more freedom to practice its religion openly. However, it was not until the passing of the, and this is the official name, Act for the Incorporation of the Arisha Movement of Trinidad and Tobago, Egbe Ilewa, in 1981, that the community saw its struggle for religious freedom validated by the Trinidadian government. The 1981 Act was perhaps the first statutory ruling to legitimize an African religious tradition in Western society. We cannot underestimate how significant that was. There was talk about it under Burnham's government in Guyana in the 70s, but it never happened. So this is a significant achievement. Consequently, under the auspices of the Ministry of Culture, Arisha communities receive support to develop archival materials that document the history and practice of the religion, to design Yoruba language programs, and invite African traditional practitioners from Nigeria to discuss ritual traditions and approaches to healing. Today, Arisha communities sponsor nationally recognized public ceremonies, including the annual Oshun Festival. If I remember, I think it's in May. I haven't been to one in a while. The Shango Festival in July and the Shango Oshun Rain Festival in June. Priests can also apply for government-issued licenses to marry couples in accordance with Arisha religious rites. And they have taken other measures to institutionalize the Arisha tradition's societal impact in the arenas of education, social service, and the arts. Though tremendous effort is still needed to secure religious freedom and respect for practitioners of African spiritual traditions, worldwide, the strides made in Trinidad under the leadership of distinguished women and men might very well indicate that a new era of increasing support for the religious heritages of the African world is now underway. In accordance with the goals of the 1981 Act, the spiritual head of the Yoruba religion, the Oni of Ife, who was Oba Akunade Sijuwade Olubuse II from Nigeria, honored the Trinidadian government's invitation to visit the island during African Emancipation Week in August 1988. The Oni's visit was well received among Arisha devotees, and reporters from Trinidad's two major newspapers, The Guardian and The Express, tracked the Oni's movements throughout the week as he visited a number of prominent Arisha shrines, attended local Arisha feasts and cultural events organized within the community, as well as nationally televised Arisha ceremonies held in Port of Spain at the National Stadium on August 1st, Emancipation Day. The Oni's visit solidified the Arisha community's resolve to preserve its Yoruba African heritage and instilled a deep sense of pride among practitioners as they encountered their supreme religious leader who symbolized their spiritual link to the African homeland. So for Catholics, it would be like the Pope coming to visit, right? So because Ile-Ife is seen as a spiritual homeland of Yorubas in Nigeria, and actually Yoruba originary narratives assert that all human beings hail from Ile-Ife, not just the Yoruba people. All of humanity came from Ile-Ife. Of lasting significance was the Oni's alleged selection of a woman as the spiritual head of Arisha practitioners in Trinidad and Tobago. It was widely accepted among the Arisha community that the late Iya Arisha, or priestess, Malvina Rodney, who recently passed in her late 90s, was selected as the spiritual head of the Arisha religion during the Oni's of Ife's visit to the island. The Oni's selection was reportedly based upon age and wisdom. Iya Rodney was a spiritual descendant of the distinguished Arisha leader Ebenezer Elliott, who they often call people Pa or Ma, or Papa or Mama. So Pa Neezer is how Elliott Ebenezer is referred to. And a very interesting connection for Ebenezer is that he was a descendant of African Americans from the United States. Once again, I mean, we talked about it last night with Jamaica, with George Lyle and George Gibb and others going over to Jamaica and really helping, in whether intentionally or not, to preserve some of that African Mile heritage. Very interesting. African Americans who fought in the War of 1812 for the British were promised tracts of land in Trinidad and were resettled in company villages. And so Pa Neezer comes from that community, but he was also supposedly trained by the renowned Ma Diamond, who was reportedly born in Africa. So Iya Rodney is seen as the head of that lineage, very well respected for that. As a shrine leader, Iya Rodney fulfilled the role of spiritual mother for hundreds of devotees in Trinidad and North America, many of whom made pilgrimages to her home for spiritual guidance and renewal and for personal and communal ritual observances. I can remember being in her home and seeing, visitors, her children, her spiritual children coming from the United States and Canada and other parts of the world, to see her, to get spiritually cleansed, to participate in the annual feast, etc. Subsequent to the Oni's visit, 2 attempts to found a council or a national council of Arisha elders resulted in the formation of an umbrella organization of 33 registered Arisha shrines governed by an official council of 6 Arisha elders. The National Council was incorporated in 1998. At the head of the council was the most senior Arisha priestess in Trinidad, of course, Iya Rodney, who then selected the other 5 members by means of spiritual divination. It is not inconsequent that those selected as elders for the council were 1, leaders of Arisha shrines, 2, the spiritual leaders of initiated godchildren. Oftentimes, the initiates are called the godchildren of the priests and priestesses who initiate them. And 3, knowledgeable about the tradition. 4, esteemed as having good, solid reputation or good standing in the society. Today, the National Council still consists of an executive committee of 6 elders, 2 of whom are also leaders in the spiritual Baptist faith, administrative personnel, and a national membership encompassing the heads of registered shrines. Its purpose, according to Professor Raul Gibbons, one of the council's chief spokespersons, was to, and I'm quoting him, establish a group that would be tolerant of difference and nonetheless establish the necessary standards that were required by the people themselves and the kind of public profile that would give the tradition a sense of social respect without having necessarily to change itself. End of quote. Underlying the formation of the council was the need to maintain a sense of autonomy within individual shrines. A significant trend within Trinidad's Arisha community involves a newer internal movement among an increasing minority of practitioners to re-Africanize religious rites and practices. Concerned primarily with issues of authenticity and ritual purity, these practitioners seek to purify the tradition of all non-African elements. One of the central aims in this movement is to establish religious standards in Trinidad that reflect those of Nigerian Yoruba. Conversely, opposing practitioners, who include the governing elders, contend that Trinidad's local interpretation of the Arisha tradition is in fact legitimate and valid. This group therefore seeks to privilege innovation and variation over purity. Within this context of competing notions of orthodoxy and orthopraxy, female leaders in the Arisha tradition have attempted to qualify the significance of Africa in shaping Trinidadian Arisha identity. By the beginning of the new millennium, as the high priestess of the Arisha tradition, that's my language, not theirs, Iya Rodney had spent 80 of her 87 years as a custodian of the Yoruba religion, as expressed in the localized beliefs and practices of Trinidadian devotees. She and the entire National Council of Elders, along with most of the current Arisha devotees in the island, represent the majority position, popularly called the full circle approach, that Trinidadian Arisha, with its mixture of ingredients from spiritual Baptist, Catholic, and sometimes Hindu traditions, is the chief authoritative source for religious instruction, representation, and practice. As stated by Professor Gibbons, and I'm quoting him, "The authority is the practice as it has taken place here in Trinidad, how it is happening. The elders will tell you that the experiences and the hardships they have gone through, that is the authority, and they don't make any bones about it. They will tell you, quoting them, we are the ones who, when they were cutting people's tails for beating drums, and when they were jailing you, we are a part of that, not you, and nobody in Africa." End of quote. That was their experience, so you can, I'm still quoting Gibbons, so you can't come now and tell them about the practice, that what they are doing is wrong, or that they have too much Christianity in what they're doing. You cannot invalidate the experiences of the elders and the people who still want to hold on to that tradition. I can't say that it doesn't have spiritual meaning for them. They kept it, it worked for them, and they fought for it. And however it was kept, it was kept. They are very clear on that. Seminal female leaders are represented on the other end of the Arisha ideological spectrum, including Iya Arisha Shangowumi. She's the head, the leader and founder of Ile Eko Shango Oshumelosha, or ISAM, from her days as a Pan-Africanist organizer in Trinidad to her sojourn into the Arisha tradition and eventual initiation into the priesthood of Shango, the divinity of fire, thunder, and rain, performed in Nigeria. Her initiation was. Shangowumi has established a sound record as a builder of social institutions. Since joining the Arisha tradition in the 1980s, Shangowumi established a school for Arisha children within the structure of a very popular shrine in southern Trinidad, in Princestown. After severing ties with her original shrine home, she founded Abiadama, an official private school at the primary level, Although the school promotes a Yoruba religious and philosophical curriculum, it is open to all children, and indeed, most of its pupils are not Arisha practitioners. Shangawumi also teaches regular adult evening classes on self-esteem, self-development, and the Yoruba tradition. Most of the persons affiliated with her shrine are current or former students from these classes, or at least the founding members of her shrine. Shangawumi's 13-year-old shrine has an active membership of 35 persons between the ages of 19 and 71, as well as the support and cooperation of numerous devotees from other shrines. She describes her mission as purposeful, with a focus on confirming old and establishing strong institutions within the Arisha tradition of Trinidad that are coherent with the spirit of classical Yoruba traditions in Nigeria. And this is on your sheet, the bottom of your first page. I recently, because I haven't been back to Trinidad in a couple years, so I wanted to see what she might have done in the last few years, even though I am in touch with her. And I looked at her Facebook page, and I found her description of the purpose of her shrine to be very, very interesting. This is a new development, because just some time ago, she was trying to get into the world of electronic communication. So this is interesting. Let's just look at this together. She writes, Ile Eko Shango Shumelosha is a spiritual community composed of Trinidadians and Tobagonians, who have come together to rediscover and reconstruct our spiritual worldview, which helps us to come to terms with our divinity and purpose for being. This community is dedicated to all dispossessed and unempowered Anago people who came from West Africa as slave cargo. Anago meaning people of Yoruba descent. I can talk about that more in the questions if someone has a question of that. Who came from West Africa as slave cargo and found themselves exiled and imprisoned mentally and many times physically in a society that is culturally opposed to anything African in an overt way. Our emphasis is on the elevation of young men and women. The community hopes to achieve this by spiritual, moral, and political redemption of African values. The community of Ile Eko Shango Shumelosha plans to reinstate the values of the ancient Yoruba wisdom, knowledge, and culture. That wisdom is preserved in the oral tradition, which is called the Odu corpus. This is the blueprint that was left for us by our ancestors. It is our inheritance, our continuity. If we use this inheritance wisely, with love, honor, respect, and understanding, it will increase in value, thereby increasing our own sense of worth and enriching our character, Iwa. We must unearth the fight for our spiritual and ancestral inheritance in the same way that we would for a familial inheritance. In the same way as there are local legal systems that we adhere to, there are spiritual laws of the universe. And the source of these laws is called Ifa. The interpretation of that law is through Orunmila. Orunmila is the deity of Ifa Divination, of the Ifa Divination system, which is the sacred text that has been transferred orally in Yoruba tradition for a long time, though many of the Odu are now written. There are 240 major Odu and 60 minor Odu and 16 major Odu, and each Odu can be, as long as 3,000 lines, maybe as short as 5 lines. They vary in length. We must always remember, she goes on, no one was born a slave, but one can become enslaved. Therefore, the reality of the ancestors' moral, spiritual, and political ethos was outside the experience of slavery. This knowledge alone should give us a deeper focus, a focus that should carry us way back before the frontiers of slavery. You kind of hear her response to the Irodni tradition that wants to root authority in what happened in Trinidad since slavery. You hear her talking back to that side in a sense. That focus attaches us to ourselves. It is through that attachment that we must see ourselves returning to our God-given freedom. Remember, we are all born free. Olodumare, who is the high god of Yoruba religion, some people would say the creator god, gave us that choice by giving us Ori, or head. Your Ori in Orisha tradition is your personal deity. And Ori is a very complex concept. It's a multiple soul construct that involves the idea of destiny, but it involves the idea of hard work, of what you must do to achieve that destiny. But it's known or believed that your Ori is your first line of defense. It is your own personal divinity, your soul. So she says, Olodumare gave us that choice by giving us Ori, or head. Let us take the backbreaking of body, mind, and spirit of slavery as an ultimate test of human strength. We should realize that we have survived slavery in the same way that we are able to beat the odds in any terrible illness. We may remain weak and unrehabilitated for a period, but it is through this period that the refocusing and healing begins. It is at this time all we can relate to is the ravages of the disease on our bodies and not count on blessings. If at this time, all we can relate to is the ravages of the disease on our bodies and not count on our blessings. For our ability to overcome, we are doomed. We are universal entities in a literal way. Therefore, the universe sustains us in the same manner as it sustains other life forms. Therefore, there are no boundaries holding us to any spot. If we tap into our resourceful universe, we will be empowered and an evolving people, ready to ply our wares profitably in this marketplace called Earth. End of quote. I thought it was important for you to hear how Arisha priests are articulating their own theologies, their own perspectives, which follows particular ideological lines of thought. It's not that they're divorced of ideology. Clearly, she wants to embrace an Arisha that is divorced from, Arisha tradition that is divorced from Christian influences. And I can talk more about that in the questions later. Contesting the full circle approach of Iya Rodney and numerous devotees, Shangawumi audaciously holds that Nigeria is the authoritative theological and philosophical source for Orisha worship in Trinidad. She identifies her shrine as a Yoruba Ile and claims to have no problem with the historical and current expressions of Orisha in Trinidad. However, she specifies that she does not adhere to such expressions, which are saturated with spiritual Baptist rituals and Christian consciousness. The full circle and Nigeria-oriented perspectives were disputed both privately and publicly during the 2001 Carnival season in Trinidad and Tobago. And I was living in Trinidad at the time for that. Let me say a little bit about that, because this is where I think often in these debates that that emerge out of a kind of cultural nationalist perspective, we see men at the head of arguments for certain forms of nationalism. But in Trinidad, we really saw two women at the head of this debate. Iya Shangawumi had decided that she was going to launch a Carnival Ban. Everyone here probably knows that Trinidad and Tobago is very famous for its annual carnival. And there are many activities connected with the carnival. She decided that she was going to launch a Carnival Ban in 2003. And this became a major issue among the National Council of Orisha Elders, because under the leadership of Iya Rodney, they did not want the Orisha desecrated in all of that bacchanal, if anybody here is from, that goes on in Carnival. I mean, let's face it, there's a lot of eroticism and sensuality associated with the Carnival, and so they didn't feel that Orisha should be represented. Now, they were not trying to in any way dictate whether individual Orisha devotees could participate. That was not the problem. They didn't want to see Orisha displayed as masquerades in the carnival. And so a bit of dispute went back and forth about this. Iya Shangawumi checked with diviners, including her own Nigerian Baba, who was one of her the priest that initiated her, about whether this could go forward by checking with through Ifa Divination. In Trinidad, Ifa Divination was not as popular, did not really emerge out of the 19th century. They use Obi divination, which is a much simpler form of divination that often gives yes or no responses. Now, Iya Shangawumi's point was, no problem. People say Ifa is the highest authority. I don't agree. All of the divination forms are the highest authority. But did they divine on this? Did they cast OB to see if this could happen? So she went forward with it. And there were all kinds of debates and disputes about whether that was correct or not. And they didn't censure her as they did censor someone else a year earlier for a similar a similar decision. And it could be that she is a very, very wealthy woman. And her husband is quite successful in the architectural and engineering businesses. And she commands a lot of power, economic power in some senses. So you never know if that's why they didn't. But she went forward with it anyway. And I felt that in the conversation, something was missed about, believe it or not, how the two sides actually do support one another, even though they might seem to be so opposed. So in analyzing the ideological postures of these opposing camps and their corresponding religious rationalizations, both camps ultimately upheld the authority of Nigerian Yoruba orthodoxy, as well as local Trinidadian tradition. Despite the council's proclamations that Trinidadian Arisha traditions are most authoritative, Iya Rodney's status as elder with the authority to dictate the norms of the Arisha tradition was held in the highest regard, especially because the African Nigerian Oni of Ife bestowed her this title. Iya Rodney's own excitement and deference to the Oni's sacred authority could not be contained as she recalled her response to his visit during a taped interview with Frances I can't remember her last name now, Frances Henry, 11 years later, and it's on your sheet. So this is Iya Rodney remembering it. Oh God, it was something, the best day of my whole life. I couldn't believe he was actually here. I had my children build a chair for this was a substantial wooden throne-like chair covered with carvings. When I see the man, I fall to the ground, touch my head to the ground. He raised me up, bless my head. I take him to my chapel. As he walk in, I fall to the ground again and say, bless me, bless me. He raised me up again and look at everything in my chapel. Later, I give him tea. He sit in the chair. He blessed my whole yard. Oh God, it was a day, like it was yesterday. So her authority is valid because a Nigerian Oni is acknowledging her as the high priestess. On the other side, Iya Shangowumi's investment in Trinidad's secular carnival tradition is in part an attempt to reclaim the African roots of carnival masquerades. Caribbean studies scholars such as Maureen Warner-Lewis, Ian Smart, and Kimani Nehusi have documented compelling parallels between Trinidadian carnival masquerades and African masquerades, especially from Nigeria. Despite her proclaimed distance from full circle Orisha traditions, it could be argued that Iya Shangowumi has a deep appreciation for the full circle concept championed by the late Iya Rodney and her constituents. She views carnival as one of many traditions with roots in the Yoruba religio-cultural heritage of ancestral masquerading societies. Carnival stands as a living testimony to the dynamic power of the Orisha religion as it evolved in local Trinidadian contexts. For Shangowumi, the sponsoring of an Orisha Carnival Band was a pedagogical exercise for the entire Trinidadian society, as she and her shrine members attempted to convey that the Orisha tradition in Trinidad has indeed come full circle to reclaim its position as a purveyor of carnival mass. The Orisha Carnival controversy serves to punctuate the distinctions between competing conceptions of what womanist anthropologist Linda Thomas calls a community's culture of origin. However, one also observes a collapsing of such distinctions as both camps, although to different degrees and in different ways, affirm Nigerian Yoruba traditions as an authoritative source for Trinidadian Orisha. Thomas coined this term in her analysis of Black women's scholarly commitment to reconstructing a womanist epistemology that authenticates the knowledge base of Black women. Says Thomas, and it's on your sheet, the people with whom we interact, the environment in which we mature, especially during our formative years, determine the kind of knowledge we acquire. We have to revisit whom and what has impacted our lives from the earliest days. I call this foundational period our encounter with our culture of origin. Therefore, the culture of origin of excluded voices becomes an important aspect of reconstructing knowledge. On the surface, the two Orisha perspectives, as I analyze them, present the Trinidadian context as culture of origin with regard to Iya Rodney's camp, as well as the Nigerian Yoruba context as culture of origin in the case of Iya Shangowumi's camp. However, as each side attempts to sway the other, they both recognize the import of Africa and diaspora, Nigeria and Trinidad, in the formation of Arisha religiosity, a dimension of the discourse that has been pretty much ignored by practitioners themselves and by scholar practitioners. As the Arisha community struggles for deeper unity, respect, and understanding, the Carnival dispute could be viewed as an opportunity to reevaluate actual points of agreement among the two groups. Second, although Thomas's notion of culture of origin is intended to signify the culture of an individual's upbringing, on the strength of the wider body of scholarly research in Black religious studies, I would argue that the African continental traditions constitute a familiar culture of origin for Black communities across the African diaspora. Indeed, Iya Rodney and Iya Shangowumi both illuminate what I have observed as a need among African diasporic populations, not all. I just watched a video of two young Black male students from a school in Texas saying the word African needs to go in African American, and they were very clear. We are Black American. We're American. Why do we even have to include African? Because we're so alienated from that. That's not our culture, et cetera, et cetera. You can find it on YouTube. It's very interesting. So not all, but in a number of diasporic populations, we see this need to authenticate and validate themselves as human beings with heritage and ancestry through a process of reclamation and re-ownership of Africa. Reclaiming and re-owning Africa can be identified as a pronounced factor in religious identity formation among Orisha devotees in Trinidad and among their counterparts in the United States. This phenomenon was first examined by Charles Long, phenomenologist himself, with specific reference to Black religion in North America. Long's work, which represents the earliest serious attempt to theorize about the image of Africa as a constitutive element of Black religiosity, is not only relevant to the North American context, but demands engagement for any scholar researching African-derived traditions in the wider Americas and Caribbean. As I examine ritual activity and priestly authority in African-derived religions like Trinidadian Orisha, the image of Africa as culture of origin undoubtedly dictates how religious identity, religious meaning, and indeed religious institutions are being created and sustained by women and the communities inspired by their leadership. Thank you.